So, good evening, everyone. My name is Isabel Molina, and I am the public programs producer here at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. I'm very pleased to welcome you to today's book talk for Family Treasures Lost and Found as part of our Stories Survive series. And today's program is co-presented by descendants of Holocaust survivors. Now, here at the museum, we are dedicated to the crucial mission of educating our diverse community about Jewish life and heritage before, during, and after the Holocaust. As part of that mission, our programs illuminate the stories of survivors, broader histories of hate and antisemitism, stories of resistance against injustice, and more. Thank you again for joining us today virtually. We hope that if you're able to, you'll visit the museum in person to see our current and upcoming exhibitions, including Art of Freedom, the life and work of Arthur Szyk, opening December 7th, 2025. Closed captions are available on today's program, and instructions on how to turn those on or off are posted in the chat. If you have questions for our speakers during the program, please put them in the Zoom Q&A box, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end of the hour. Again, that's the Zoom Q&A box and not the chat. But in the Zoom chat, you will find several helpful links, including links to purchase Family Treasures, as well as the recently released audiobook version. Now today, we are honored to be joined by Karen A. Frenkel and Dr. Eva Fogelman. Karen A. Frenkel is a technology journalist, editor, author, and documentary producer. In addition to writing Family Treasures Lost and Found, Karen has produced 2 versions of a tie-in documentary with the same title. One version is a 75-minute feature, and the other was edited for high school students and is accompanied by a discussion guide for teachers. Early in her career, Karen co-authored with Isaac Asimov Robots, Machines, and Man's Image, and has written 3 books for children about physics. Her articles have appeared in Bloomberg Businessweek, Bloomberg.com, Communications of the ACM, Discover, Essence, FastCompany.com, Forbes, New Media, Science Magazine, Scientific American, Technology Review, The New York Times, The Village Voice, U.S. News and World Report, and other national publications. Her previous award-winning documentaries cover the impact of technology on society and appeared on public television. Minerva's Machine, Women and Computing, examines why few women were engineers and computer scientists in the 1980s and 90s. And Net.Learning, a 2-hour documentary, explores the trade-offs students and faculty made in early online classrooms. Karen also blogs for the Times of Israel and previously wrote a blog called We Are One, a Family of. Both address her parents' wartime experiences and parallels today. Dr. Eva Fogelman is a licensed psychologist, author, and filmmaker. She is a founder of the Second Generation movement, as well as the Hidden Child Foundation. Fogelman wrote and co-produced the award-winning film, Breaking the Silence, The Generation After the Holocaust, and is author of the Pulitzer Prize nominee, Conscience and Courage, Rescuers of Jews During the Holocaust. Thank you all again for joining us, and now I'm going to hand things over to Karen and Eva.
Thank you, Isabel, for organizing my conversation with Karen Frenkel. My gratitude to the Museum of Jewish Heritage for bringing a program that's not only relevant to descendants of Holocaust survivors, but to others who are unearthing a family history of the main actors who are no longer with us. Just a word about the book, Family Treasures Lost and Found, reads like our detective book. Karen has been able to transform her investigative, technological journalism skills to unravel her parents' life before the Holocaust, their traumatic experience surviving anti-Semitic infested Austria before and after the Anschluss, German-occupied Poland, the aftermath of building a new life, and what it's like for 3 daughters of Holocaust survivors to grow up in America with Holocaust survivor parents. In recent years, genealogy and searching for roots has become so commonplace for the baby boomer generation. What is different for sons and daughters of Holocaust survivors is that most don't have pictures, documents, or heirlooms. Karen has been fortunate to find a treasure, which you will find out about in our discussion tonight. When Holocaust survivors would meet somebody who had an accent, they would begin to ask, "Von wamen kommt der Jid?" From where does a Jew come? And then they would ask, "And wo bist du gewesen in der Krieg?" And where were you during the war? And now the second generation is doing the same kind of thing. When you discover that somebody is a child, a grandchild of Holocaust survivors, you begin to ask, what country were your parents and grandparents from? What happened to them during the war? So Karen, in order to get a little of a background of your memoir, can you tell us a very brief history of your parents, where they came from, and what happened to them during the war?
Sure, but before I do that, I'd just like to thank you for that introduction to my memoir, and also Isabel for presenting the event tonight. And thank you to the audience for joining us. My parents were both Polish Jews. My mother was born in Berlin but raised in Krakow, and my father was born in Lvov, now Lviv, Ukraine.
And do you want to tell us just a little bit about their life before the war, and then just a little bit, very briefly, about what happened to them after the war?
Yes.
I mean, during the war, I meant.
Yes. My mother was an only child. She was the daughter of an attorney, and my grandmother was lady of leisure and sang opera as a hobby. And I grew up listening to tales of them strolling on the Planta with their German pointer. And they were, my mother's first languages were German and Polish. And she spoke German fluently without an accent at all. My father was one of three boys, and I know very little about his past, but there was one anecdote he would tell us about what rascals they were, and how when their parents were at the opera, which was only a few blocks away in the heart of the city, my father and my uncles would swing from the chandelier, and at one point crashed into my grandmother's china cabinet, and that was a sort of a disaster. They were severely reprimanded. My father was my father was the middle child, and he and his older brother went abroad for school. And first, my father joined his brother in Brno. My father was in medical school. My uncle wanted to be an engineer, and my father eventually transferred to the University of Vienna for his medical degree.
And what happened to your mother during the war?
My mother and her parents fled from Krakow on the 3rd of September, 1939, and took the train east as far as it could go, which was the end of the line at a city called Tarnopol, which is now Ternopil in Ukraine. They then backtracked for the first half a year and eventually ended up in Lviv. And then my mother separated, they lived under the Soviet occupation until June of 1941. And then my mother's parents feared for her safety because young girls were being thrown into brothels and never heard from again, and they insisted that she separate from them. So she went back west to Tarnow, which is about an hour from Krakow, and stayed there for a while with her aunt, who was a physician. And then she got false papers. Her false papers came from her mother, who arranged for them in Lvov. They arrived after my mother and her great aunt and cousins were forced into the Tarnow ghetto. And then my mother walked out of the ghetto and went to Germany and volunteered to be a slave laborer there, disguised as a Polish Catholic.
And one of the family dynamics that are unique to Holocaust survivor families is the communication in the families. Some families have total silence. Sometimes children of survivors eavesdrop in their parents' conversations when they were getting together to play cards or have coffee or Shabbat dinner, and children of survivors would hear some of the conversations. Oh, so-and-so died and so-and-so was killed. And in other families, there was incessant mentioning of the persecution, of the losses. And in rare cases, there was total denial of having been in the Holocaust at all. Karen, perhaps you can read us from Family Treasures Lost and Found to give us a glimpse of the communication dynamics in your family growing up.
Sure. I'm going to read you the first page and a few lines of the first chapter called Treasure. Be very gentle with Daddy this time of year, my mother cautioned one spring in the mid-1960s. That's when he feels sad. To my preteen mind, my father relished the greenery and rebirth that arrived with the season. Every April, he welcomed dillodaffs, as he playfully referred to his favorite flower, the first to bloom in Forest Hills, New York, our garden. Why does he feel sad? I asked, puzzled by my mother's words. She hesitated and then blurted, because that's when his mother took the poison. During World War II, my father's blonde, blue-eyed mother had tried to pass for a Polish Catholic. But when the Gestapo stormed into her apartment in Lvov, now Lviv, Ukraine, she bit into cyanide rather than be deported to a concentration or death camp. I accepted that the subject was untouchable and obeyed my mother, except once. I was unendingly curious about the woman whose fair hair, fair skin, and figure I had inherited, as far as I could tell, at least from the lone photograph with which my father arrived here in 1939. One evening, I asked about my grandmother, Michaela. The look of surprise and hurt in my father's blue-gray eyes showed me that I had been intrusive, clumsy. He rose from his chair and silently left the dining room. I followed, apologizing profusely. He accepted. I tried again, asking what she was like. I don't want to talk about it. Understanding that he needed to be alone, I backed off and never again approached him about his past.
Now, despite this, difficulty in really finding out who your father is, as you were growing up, can you tell us a little bit about what your family life was like growing up with two older sisters?
Yeah. I have two sisters. One is 7 years ahead of me, and her name is Michelle. She's named for my grandmother, Michaela. And the middle sister, who's only a year and a half older than I am, is named Ivy Teresa for my mother's parents, Isidore and Teofila. We had a happy child, I think, to a large extent. We were very precious to our parents. We knew that we were very, very important to them, and they guided us and paid a great deal of attention to what went on in school, what we were studying, and achievement was very important. My mother decided at a fairly early point, when Michelle was finishing elementary school, that she wanted us to have a European, somewhat European education, and she researched the private schools in our neighborhood in Forest Hills, was not satisfied with them, and she heard about the United Nations International School, and that's where we all went. And that was important in terms of our identity, because although we were very Jewish identified, we celebrated the main holidays. Rosh Hashanah was always celebrated, Hanukkah as well, and Passover was, Seders were held in our house once one of our great uncles died. What was so important about the UN school in terms of identity was that many of the children were the children of diplomats, or their parents were foreign born. And so I thought of my parents as European Jews. I didn't think of them as Holocaust survivors, and we didn't have that vocabulary at the time in the 60s.
Right, so you didn't feel very different from others in the early years growing up. Now, when you
Exactly.
were like almost 13 years old, a treasure fell into your lap. Could you tell us a little bit about that treasure?
Yes, my grandmother, my mother's mother, Teofila, was one of four siblings, and she had two sisters. One survived and one did not. The one who survived, my great aunt Lutza, died in 1968, and she lived up in Washington Heights in the same building as her brother and her parents. So when my great grandparents died, my Aunt Lutza took over their apartment. And when my mother and Lutza's daughter were going through her belongings, my mother came upon plastic garbage bags filled with documents and loose photos that I assume at one point had been in albums, but were either in those bags or in tin cookie tins, and also fabulous portraits of my grandmother Teofila and Lutza as young girls, and it was a pastel painting done in 1912, as was the portrait of my great grandmother Sarah and my great grandfather Heinrich, and there was a portrait also in pastel of the brother, my great uncle I mentioned. And my mother and my mother's cousin, Lutza's daughter, didn't want anything. So my mother came home with these beautiful portraits that were so stately and striking. And I remember her looking at the one of my grandmother and my great aunt and spending quite a long time looking at them at different intervals, and was very careful to have them properly cleaned and framed because they had been rolled up and hidden for so long. And she was very hurt that in all those years no one had thought to tell her that such a facsimile of her mother as a young girl existed.
Now, you spoke about your education growing up. Could you tell us a little bit about what the family was like, the kinds of things you did as a family, the influence your mother and your father had on you?
We, aside from our studies, we had, my sisters took piano. I played piano as well, but opted out for the flute. There was a lot of music in the house. My father loved Brahms and Beethoven, and he also played the piano. And they went to the opera often on Saturday nights, and my father had lots of colleagues, and they socialized with colleagues and other survivors. And I could tell who my mother was talking to based on whether she spoke on the phone with her relatives or friends in German or Polish, and the tone of voice. I could tell who had called.
So what language was spoken at home?
My parents spoke English, and when we started to understand Polish, when they would speak Polish when they didn't want us to understand what they're talking about over dinner. And we, excuse me?
The secret language.
Yes, and then I started to catch on, and one day I was being picky about my food, and my mother asked me why, and my father too, why wasn't I eating? And I said, "To jest flaki," which means, for those of you who don't know Polish, it means it's gristle. And my mother and my father looked at each other and they said, I think it was my mother, our first child to say a Polish sentence. And then they started to correct me and they said, it's not flaki, Kareny, it's flak. And then I remember looking at my sisters and we already knew that that they did say flaki. So it was amusing. But my father and my parents then switched to German, which my father did not like to speak. It was also his first language. He also spoke German and Polish as a child because during World War I, his family left Lvov and lived in Vienna, where we had relatives who owned a hotel, and he stayed at the hotel, and his father worked in the hotel and had shares in the hotel. But my father did not like to speak German, even though he very much loved Vienna. So I felt I had burdened him and made him feel uncomfortable by requiring yet another language. So I then signaled by spacing out and dawdling that I wasn't really listening so much, and they reverted back to Polish.
What I understand there was a very traumatic experience when you were 15 years old, and how did that change your life?
When I was 15, in December of 1970, my father died suddenly of a heart attack. And we were completely unprepared for that. We were completely unprepared because we didn't know what my mother knew, which was that he had some symptoms, and she had insisted that he make an appointment to see a cardiologist. And a week and a half later, after he died, would have been the appointment with the cardiologist. And we took it very hard because of the suddenness and obvious reasons. But looking back on it, it had to do, the shock also had to do with the fact that we hadn't experienced the death of our relatives. We didn't know 3 of our grandparents. They were murdered, and the sole surviving grandfather died when we were young. I don't remember him at all. I was a toddler. My older sister Michelle remembers him and a little bit, and Ivy remembers him asking her to sing a jingle of the Mr. Clean advertising song, but our memories are sparse, and we didn't experience the normal passages of life and understand that people die. It was just catastrophic for us.
Yeah. Now, 2Gs, when their parents die, sometimes find out things that are a little shocking that they knew nothing about. Somebody blurts it out at the cemetery, or you see documents. And is there anything like that happened to you?
About a year after our father died, we were going through his papers. He had an office. He had an office where he saw patients in our home in the lower level in the basement, but he also had another small office off the kitchen. And suddenly Michelle had in her hand a piece of paper she had taken out of an envelope. She said to my mother, who was in the kitchen, "Mom, who is Rose Frenkel?" And my mother hesitated, and she came in and she said, "Oh, well, your father was married before he met me." And we had no idea. We had absolutely no idea that there had been a whole other marriage, and we didn't know much about her. And the little that our mother told us then was that they had been married in Lvov, and that when my father arrived here, he found out that she had a boyfriend. Her lover was a gangster, and my father wanted out of the marriage, and they got divorced. And that's all we knew.
And who was this family?
And she also said actually that the woman her name was Rose, and the woman was the black sheep, she said, of the family that owned the very famous dairy restaurants Ratner's on the Lower East Side.
Wow. Now, what else did you find out about your father in terms of his medical training? And I know that he couldn't Most Jews could not get an education in medical school in Poland, and went to Vienna, which was one of the best medical schools at the time. What did you learn that you didn't know about your father's medical education in Vienna in the 30s?
Well, on my quest, I sort of made a rule for myself that I would Google anything that fell into my head. And one day, I decided to Google the Polish spelling of my father's first name and his last name. And I was amazed to discover a virtual memorial book that was created by historians at the University of Vienna. And they documented that about more than 2,000 students and about, I don't have the numbers, exact numbers, but a large percent of the faculty were dismissed because they were Jews. And the page that I landed on was my own father's page with a photograph of him that I recognized immediately from a notebook that I found in my mother's files that seemed to me to be a kind of report card, but the historians who I contacted and worked with for about a half a year explained to me that this was a national that listed all the courses that he took for his medical degree and how much he had paid for each course. And I knew he had gone to the University of Vienna Medical School, but I didn't know the years. And I was told by my mother that he had left Vienna right upon the Anschluss, and there was a tale of him having had his oral exams for his MD in a taxi cab on the way to the station. So I had assumed from what she told us that he had not been there during the Anschluss, but I learned through the documents that I found through the historians and the document that they explained to me that my father had actually witnessed the Anschluss, did not know that he was going to be able to get his degree because they were expelling Viennese Jews and Austrian Jews. But he was allowed, it turned out, to graduate in June of 1938, 2 months after the Anschluss, because he was a foreign student.
Wow.
Not because, they didn't recognize him as being Jewish. There's nothing said about that, but he was Polish. And that's why he got his medical degree.
Then he returned to Lvov.
Then he returned to Lvov. And here's where I was never exactly sure about what happened, because I did have the first marriage certificate. My mother had saved that. And on it, it said that Rose, his first wife, her address was in Lvov, and I found the address on the map, and I saw that it was around the corner from my grandparents' house. And then I began to think that this match had been arranged, but we couldn't really prove how they had met. And also, I later found out that the witness on my father's side had married this woman's cousins. So two cousins married two cousins, and that did not seem to be a coincidence either. So they separated, my father and Rose, after the wedding and my father's birthday, and she went back to New York on a luxurious ocean liner, and my father traveled by train to Paris, and I figured out what the name was of his ship that he sailed on to the Western Hemisphere.
This was your detective work.
It was really, there's a lot of details in my book about how I figured out what ship it was and how I corresponded with the French lines, which was the owner of the French ship. I did know, actually, that my father, according to my mother, had sailed to Mexico, and that he had saved the life of someone on the dock who had a medical emergency, and then he talked his way off of this ship, which was called Flandre. And then he waited till his wife helped him get his visa and sent it to him. But I did not know until my quest that he was in Havana Harbor at the same time as the St. Louis, the very famous German refugee ship, and a third ship, which was a British ship, and that all of the Jews were turned away in Havana, and that Havana had been my father's original destination.
Wow. So
And
somebody had a question about the Anschluss. The Anschluss was when Germany invaded Austria in March of 1938 and basically annexed Austria. And one of the things that they first did is they had all the Jewish men basically take toothbrushes and begin to clean the sidewalks, and obviously a lot of them were then taken into concentration camps, the Dachau in particular, and Buchenwald, who were already in existence at the time. And then all the racial laws that existed in Germany then were transferred to Austria as well. Now, since we're moving along here and we have a lot to cover in terms of how you began to write this book, why don't we move a little bit to your mother and ask, how did you convince your mother to give a testimony to the Fortune Off Yale Oral History Project? And what did your mother say to you that perhaps may have been a subconscious seed to write the book? It was almost an unconscious, subconscious transforming moment for you. And how old were you then?
when I was in my 30s, I was active in a grassroots organization for children of Holocaust survivors, and I heard that the Yale Fortune of Video Archive was interviewing Holocaust survivors locally in Forest Hills. And I had wanted to interview my mother, and I would come over with my tape recorder and sit down with her and say, okay, let's go ahead, let's start. And she always demurred. She always put me off. And it frustrated me. So when I found out that they were interviewing Holocaust survivors, I said, come on, Mom, won't you do it? If not with me, through them. And then we'll have it. Just do it. Please, just do it. And I nagged her. And finally she gave in, and she brought with her some documents, and she did an hour and a half of testimony. And that was very important, because when she would tell us, without a tape recorder going, it was very difficult to keep the chronology straight. And that's really because she and her parents were literally zigzagging across Galicia, across southern Poland, as they fled. And the names were Polish, and two of the cities were similar sounding, and she would get impatient when I confused those cities, and that was Tarnow and Tarnopol. And on my quest, I actually found out that they were both named for the same Polish nobleman. So there was a reason for my confusion. But so she did it. She was not satisfied with it, and she said, well, maybe someday you'll do something with it.
Right. So that sort of put some seeds in your mind that were just percolating there, and will put it at abeyance. Now, how long was it before you actually listened to the tape? There were some children of survivors who still have not listened to their parents' tape, and or wait many years till they're deceased. And what was that like for you?
Well, I did watch part of the tape one summer, not that long after she did the recording. They sent a courtesy videotape, and I remember watching it and being very irritated because I felt she was ill at ease. I felt that it was a little bit hard to follow, because the same problem of where they were, where they fled, kept coming up, and there was confusion on the part of the interviews. She had two interviewers, and so I stopped watching it. I don't know how much of it I watched, but it was always on my mind. And finally, in 2001 or so, my mother had already been dead for 3 years, and I sat down with my laptop in my husband and Ed's our living room and the VCR and put myself in reporter mode and transcribed the thing.
Wow.
And it was only, I often transcribed actually my interviews when I was reporting on the technology industry because I wanted to get inside the heads of my sources. I wanted to not just have the words presented to me by someone else who had transcribed it. I wanted the tone of voice, and I wanted to feel the hesitation. I wanted to get the intention, not so much what was said, but the intention. And so I immersed myself in it, and then I cut and pasted it so that I could so that I could have the chronology straight. I created the order that I was missing always, and so that was a really important and very big step.
Sequential narrative is very hard because survivors often just tell you dribs and drabs, and they don't, it's the interviewer that has to really put the sequential narrative together for the survivor's life. What would you say made you decide to write the book?
It was a very gradual non-decision, really. It kind of happened because I had tried in every decade of my adult life to approach this subject. The first time was when I took a class on screenwriting, and I decided to write about an experience I had on a trip to Europe with my family, and my father took us to Vienna, and he brought us, my sisters and me, to his favorite fountain, which was the Donnerbrunnen, and he showed us this fountain of it was a Baroque fountain with bronze statues, and one of them seemed to be climbing into the basin of the fountain. And my father made a quip, and he said, after all these years, he still hasn't made it in. And I was 5.5, and I said, Daddy, it's a statue, But that stayed with me, and really, he was telling me part of his experience in Vienna, because he was not allowed as a foreign student, and would not have been allowed as a Jew to practice medicine in Vienna. That he was expected to go back to where he came from. And so that was in my 20s. And then in my 30s, as I said, I tried to get my mother to make the recording and succeeded, which was great because we had that for the film. And then I decided to get my father's tour of duty from the National Archives. So I wrote to the National Archives, and I was sent what I realized could not possibly have been the unit history, because it didn't match any of the photos, the few that I could identify, because you couldn't label them. And I got discouraged by the jargon. And then in my late 50s, I thought, if I don't do this now, then when? Hillel the Elder, if not now, then when? That's when I sat down and went through my mother's testimony. And then one day I decided to Google my father's address. I knew we had his address in Lvov in my mother's documents.
What would you say were the greatest challenges you faced in transitioning from journalism and reporting to a memoir?
So my training was, very classic training in journalism. I was supposed to be things have changed a lot. We were trained, baby boomers in general, I think, and older, were trained to not be present and to let our readers decide as much as possible for themselves based on the facts and the quotes that we got from our sources. And I remained very much in the background in my feature stories, which were about computer science and profiles of computer scientists who were researching all the technologies that make your phones smart today. And so I went about recording my discoveries as a reporter, a kind of omniscient reporter, but I wanted to imitate a historical novel, and it's just that the characters were my relatives. They were real. And that account, I call it, did not sell. And the feedback was, well, who are you? And how do you feel about what you learned, what you discovered? And I was reluctant to insert myself because of my training, but also because I felt that my parents were the ones who were fascinating. They were the
Mhm.
most interesting people to me. And I didn't want it to be about me. But I had told a lot of my friends and my sisters and anybody really who would listen about my discoveries, and one of them was Marcia Rock, and we decided to collaborate on the documentaries that were described at the opening of this evening. And and I had an editor for the first account, and she was a memoir teacher and really a memoirist herself. And she said, I think that you should take my class. And she taught me. Her name is Mindy Lewis, and she's wonderful. She was great, and she taught me the genre. And it took me a few months to catch on to the idea that I could report a scene, you know, but I had the genre required that I comment on it, that I conjecture, that I ask questions and speculate, and that I could even imagine what had happened and weave that into the account. And that's what I did with her help.
So how did you juggle producing a documentary and writing the novel? How did that work out?
Well, I knew the material cold at that point, and I people think I'm a little odd, but to me it was a rewrite job. I had the first account, I needed to repurpose it. And I did it. The key thing was pacing the work. And Marcia is a documentary director, an independent documentary director, but also a professor. And when there were lulls and lags in that part, in that project, I would be working on my assignment that was due every 3 weeks. We had a cycle, and I would have my I don't know, I forgot how many pages. I think we could have up to 15 pages every 3 weeks. And that's how I did it. And I made some discoveries during the process as well.
Mm. Now, you are clearly the memorial candle in your family. And how did your sisters transform the family legacy into their professions?
It was a very interesting thing. I mean, my sister Michelle was a publisher. She was the president and publisher of Crown, and she had published several memoirs and of Holocaust survivors. There was one by Eva Hoffman, I believe,
She's the second generation, right?
and so Michelle published that, and she would sort of gently let my mother know. I think subtly suggesting that my mother might write something, but she was very familiar with Holocaust literature. And again, in my 50s, she started feeding me books to read, and one of them was David Laskin's The Family. And that was a three-part history of his family, and one part was what happened to the family in Europe that was still in Europe during the Holocaust. And there was another part who were the entrepreneurs who founded the company Maidenform. And I thought, well, I have a pretty interesting family history too. I have this branch of the family that left Krakow to seek gold during the California gold rush. I mean, I knew of them, and I had asked my great uncle, the one who lived in Washington Heights, to tell me about them, and he wrote me a fabulous letter about them. So I picked up where he left off, and I tried to search for them. Every time I went out to Silicon Valley, my mother would say, maybe you could try and find them. But it turned out that I had the wrong spelling of their new name. They took a new name. The name was Marx, and I thought it was spelled with an X, like the philosopher.
Now, your
So,
other sister.
And so Michelle helped by feeding me things, and also Helen Fremont's memoir about her parents who were also from Lvov, and as you pointed out, her father's also a doctor. I read that, and I thought, well, I could perhaps do something like that as well. And Ivy, who's the middle sister and a therapist, had also thought that when she listened to my discoveries that I should write about this sort of treasure hunt that I was on. And and so they both, and she was my mother's confidant very early on, and knew things about my mother's experience that I did not. And there were some things in the oral history my mother omitted, and each daughter had some things that our mother didn't tell the others. So
Put
I put it all together.
it together, beautiful. Now,
Yeah.
what would you say now that you've finished the film, the book? How has that changed how you're feeling about your past, your present?
Uh, I it was a transformative experience in the sense that I never spoke of my grandparents as grandmother, grandfather, or grandma or grandpa. I thought of them as my mother's mother, my mother's father, and so forth. There was a feeling of distance. And the way that I coped with the fact that I grew up without grandparents was to think of them as distant relatives. But on this quest, I achieved what I understand historians call historical imagination. When I found my grandparents' house in Lviv today, and could see how unique and interesting the building was, because it's actually a UNESCO World Heritage Site, it turns out, with its majolica tiles and beautiful facade and filigree balconies. I could then imagine my grandmother Michaela sitting on a balcony on the second floor, sipping cafe, maybe having some Linzer tort with a friend, and try to see things from her point of view, imagining her surroundings and her taste at having wanted to live in such a beautiful building.
Mm.
And I never thought about her in that way until I could picture the surroundings and her in them.
Feel a sense of rootedness in terms of feeling much more connected to where you came from than you did before. This is going to be our summation.
Yes, I felt an unexpected affection for my lost relatives, and I felt that I had honored them by finding out as much as could possibly be uncovered, so that their lives were not lost to history, and so that my family and my sister's children and their children and in perpetuity will know where they came from.
Mm.
And I would like to say to the audience that I deliberately, in the book and we in the film, deliberately offered details and specifics about my relatives' lives, so that they would be real, seem like real characters, real people, and be more understandable. And I think with understanding who they were, people of all walks of life will feel empathy for them and their plight, and I think that can be very healing. And so I was hoping that in showing people how I did my research, they might be inspired to do their own family history research and perhaps come away with this feeling of connectedness and maybe find some solace for, if they have lost people, as my family did. And I also, one last thing, just want to say that I also wanted very much for the public to understand how journalists thinks, and how you follow one lead and one lead leads to another lead, and then you begin to have a story. You can tell the story in a way that's meaningful because people will relate to those things that you've discovered, because even though they haven't experienced the same thing, they have had similar emotions and feelings. And if anybody would like to be in touch with me, they can ask me questions, and I can advise them, and they can reach me through the memoir's website.
Get over to Isabel to see what questions have come up in our discussion here.
Great. Well, first, thank you so much, Karen and Eva, for such a wonderful conversation. We do have some questions for you this evening. I'm going to combine some questions that were a bit similar, and apologies in advance to anyone if I don't get to your question. But Karen, I'll start. We have a couple audience members. We know you touched on this briefly during the conversation, but we have a couple people who are wondering if you can talk a bit more about the process of writing this book, and in particular, the research process. And they're wondering how much research you did and had to do in order to supplement your family's story and what that was like.
When I first started researching online, I was amazed at how much I could uncover. And that's because the world's archives are being digitized, and that has democratized the process. So I just, as I said, I made a rule that I would ask the most absurd, far-fetched question and see what came up. And it started to seem almost magical that the questions got answered. I was lucky because I had documents that had addresses and things like that. But I did use a professional genealogist for Lviv because of the language barrier, but also the documents are, many of them are still handwritten, and even the older ones in that part of Europe are in Fraktur, which is the sort of Gothic German font, or a typeface. And you need someone to slog through all that who has experience with it. So I hired a genealogist. His name is Alex Dunai in Lviv. He's also a historian, and he helped me a great deal. And I was able to find out when my grandmother Michaela was born, and not when, but where. That was one date we were not able to find. But I found out that she lived in a shtetl not far from where my grandfather lived, and that she was from a very large family, which I knew, but I didn't know anything about them, except her maiden name, and that they lived in Lemberg, which is the Austro-Hungarian name for Lviv. And so I would say that the heart of the research took really 6 years, and it was not that orderly. One thing led to another, and when I got stuck, I actually did something that I was thinking the other day I learned from Isaac Asimov. He was so prolific, and I remember saying to him, well, how do you get so much done, and doesn't it ever get lonely? And he said, oh, well, I deliver all my manuscripts in person. I thought, oh, okay, that's interaction. And he said, but I also have 3 desks. And when I have done enough on one project, I move to the next desk. Here, I didn't do that literally, but when I got stuck with one relative's story, I went to another relative. So I got stuck with my father's tour of duty at one point because I had the wrong, I thought his tour of duty was only what was on the separation papers. So I got stuck with that, and then I went and tried to find out how my grandfather left Lvov and when, because he trekked through the Carpathian Mountains to Budapest and then somehow showed up in Constanza in Romania and got on a ship to Palestine, and it was all illegal and had that happen. So, it was a way of taking a break from something that I got stymied by. The writing was done partly as I went along. I was very careful to keep both print files and computer files. And all writing, I want to tell everybody, all writing is rewriting. It's really important to understand that you're not going to get the version that's published on the first try or the 10th try. And with computers, we don't even know how many drafts there are anymore, right? But you have to break it down. Books are written, some people write, they have a quota, say, oh, I'm going to write 4 pages a day, and I'm going to do it in the morning, when my mind is fresh. And some people are night owls, and they have a burst of energy and can write 10 pages a day. I wrote when I felt like it, which was really most of the time I felt like it. I never had writer's block. And because I was telling my family and friends about my discoveries, those really were kind of rehearsals for what would be put eventually into print.
Beautiful.
Yeah, thank you. Such interesting insight into your process.
Thank you.
We have another, of course, we have another question. A couple of people actually have asked about the reaction to your book and what that has been like, both from the general public, but also from family members. And in particular, you mentioned your 2 sisters who were also instrumental in kind of helping you get to the finished process. So what has everyone sort of made of the book, and what have they thought of its publication?
Well, the answer has to be biased because I don't think anybody would tell me that they hated the book. But there are 13 reviews on Amazon that are all very positive. They're 5 stars, and people are fascinated with the detective work that I did. And that's what I wanted. I wanted to draw people in by having them join me in the process of discovery, even though they were joining me after the fact. But I wanted them to come along and come with me, and I wanted to share it with them. And I talked to them as best I could, which is another thing that Isaac did. His writing was very much like his speech, and mine isn't. But I had that in mind. I think that people. I think I was very lucky in many ways because of the archive that was discovered in 1968, and because my mother did cooperate and do her oral history, and stunningly, there was an article written about my father sailing into Cuba, and Rose trying to get the anti-Semitic Cuban immigration official to let him disembark, and that was a stunning thing to find such an article. But and people are just amazed, and so am I, that I was able to find that. So I think that the people are quite positive, and so were the blurbs in the front of the book by well-known people in the field, including Eva.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. I know we're almost at time, but I'm going to sneak in one last question, which I think will be a nice question to leave off on. Someone is asking if you have any advice for any viewers who may be looking to start the research into their family's story, or who are looking to start the writing process of getting their family's stories written down and documented.
The advice I can give people is for the countries where my family is from. So for Poland, you can try the Warsaw Agad archives, which have genealogical records, birth certificates, marriage certificates, and census information on the Jewish population in the cities of Poland through all of its transformations and under multiple governments, and for what was Poland but is now Western Ukraine, meaning Lviv and surrounding areas. You can go to the Ukrainian State Archives, but you can't really do it unless you have someone who's familiar with the language or you speak the language yourself. That I don't think is online, but and also for Germany, the Arelsen Archives, which was the former International Tracing Service, is a way to find out what happened to lost relatives during the Nazi occupation. And I found out when my grandfather fled Lviv as a result of correspondence uncovered there. So also for Israel, Israel has the Central Zionist Archives, which in my case had a document showing when my grandfather arrived, on what boat, and that he was interned in Camp Atlit, which was the British camp for illegal refugees. And that's, I think, as much as I can fit in here. But as I said, people can contact me and ask me questions and consult me.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much. And thank you, Eva, so much for your incredible moderation of the discussion this evening. And of course, thank you so much to our audience for joining us. Just quickly before we end tonight, I'd like to remind everyone that you can purchase Family Treasures Lost and Found at the links in the chat. There's links for multiple countries, US and internationally. I highly encourage everyone to take a look. There is also a link where you can purchase the recently released audiobook version. Also, if you enjoyed today's program, we hope you'll consider making a donation to support the museum, which you can do at mjhnyc.org/support. We also hope you'll join us for our upcoming programs, which you can find at mjhnyc.org/current events. And that's all for now. Thank you all so much for joining us, and we hope you have a great night. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you both.